The morning of August 7th, 1943, over Bougainville, in the Solomon Islands, Lieutenant Rex Barber rolled his P-38 Lightning into a hard left turn that should have killed him. He was chasing a Mitsubishi A6M0 at 300 miles per hour, barely 200 feet above the jungle canopy. The Zero pilot, later identified as Petty Officer First Class Takeo Tanimizu of the Imperial Japanese Navy, had just executed what Japanese naval aviators called the Hineri Komi, a violent snap roll combined with a chandelle climb that exploited the legendary maneuverability of Japan's premier fighter. Barber should have stalled. Every pilot who flew twin-engine aircraft knew the fundamental aerodynamic truth. When you bank hard in a conventional twin, the aircraft wants to roll further into the turn because of torque. Both engines, spinning their propellers in the same direction, create a rotational force that fights your control inputs. In a hard combat turn, this torque effect becomes dangerous. The fighter skids through the air, bleeding energy, losing lift on the inside wing. Stall speed increases. The aircraft shudders, buffets, and if you push it too far, it departs controlled flight entirely. But Barber's P-38 didn't do any of those things. The Lightning carved through the turn with an authority that seemed to defy physics. The control yoke remained responsive, solid, predictable. There was no fighting against engine torque, because there was no engine torque, not the way other aircraft experienced it. The left engine's propeller spun clockwise when viewed from the pilot's seat. The right engine's propeller spun counterclockwise. The torque forces cancelled each other perfectly. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Barber kept the turn tight, tighter than the Zero pilot expected from a twin-engine fighter that weighed 6 tons more than his nimble A6M. The Zero leveled out from its climb, the pilot glancing back to confirm what he already assumed, that the heavy American twin had fallen behind, unable to match a Zero in a turning fight. Every Imperial Navy aviator knew this truth. Twin-engine fighters were fast in a straight line, useful for interception and escort, but helpless in a dogfight against a purpose-built single-engine fighter like the Zero. Tanimizu saw the P-38 still behind him, still closing, still in the turn. His Zero had a wingspan of 39 feet 3 inches and weighed just under 6,000 pounds fully loaded. The Lightning had a 52-foot wingspan and weighed over 17,000 pounds combat loaded. Yet here it was, matching his turn, refusing to fall away. The assumption that governed fighter combat in the Pacific, that maneuverability belonged exclusively to lightweight single-engine fighters, was about to be tested in a way that would confuse Japanese intelligence officers for months afterward. Because Lieutenant Barber's ability to stay in that turn, to keep his guns pointed at that Zero, to ultimately shoot it down in a manner that seemed to violate everything both sides understood about aircraft performance, came down to a single engineering decision made 4 years earlier by a team at Lockheed Aircraft Corporation in Burbank, California. A decision that seemed, to many conventional aeronautical engineers at the time, unnecessarily complicated. Why use 2 different propeller rotation directions when you could simply manufacture everything to turn the same way? Why create unique left-hand and right-hand engine installations when standardization was cheaper and simpler? The answer would reshape fighter tactics in the Pacific and force Japanese naval aviation to completely reassess what they thought they knew about American aircraft design philosophy. In 1937, when the United States Army Air Corps issued its Circular Proposal X-608 requesting designs for a high-altitude interceptor, the specifications seemed almost impossible to meet with existing technology. The Army wanted an aircraft capable of reaching 360 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, with a ceiling of at least 33,000 feet. It needed to carry heavy armament. The specification called for at least one 37mm cannon and multiple machine guns. It required twin engines for reliability over long distances, acknowledging the vast expanses of ocean that might need to be crossed in any future Pacific conflict. Most importantly, it needed to climb to 20,000 feet in under 6 minutes. No existing fighter could meet all these requirements. Single-engine fighters lacked the power and reliability. Existing twin-engine designs were too heavy and too slow in climb rate. The proposal represented a fundamental challenge to conventional fighter design. Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, then a relatively small company compared to Cation, giants like Boeing or Douglas saw an opportunity. Their chief engineer, Hall Hibbard, assigned the project to a team led by Clarence Kelly Johnson, a brilliant young aerodynamicist who had joined Lockheed just 3 years earlier at age 23. Johnson was already gaining a reputation for unconventional solutions to aerodynamic problems. He thought in terms of total systems rather than isolated components. The design that emerged was radical. Johnson proposed a twin-boom configuration that placed the engines in nacelles, extending forward from the wings, with the pilot sitting in a central pod between the booms. The tail surfaces connected the two booms at the rear. This layout offered multiple advantages. The propellers, mounted on the nose of each engine nacelle, operated in clean, undisturbed air. The central pod could house weapons firing through the nose without having to synchronize with propeller rotation. The twin-boom tail provided excellent stability and control, authority. But the configuration created a significant challenge: engine torque. In a conventional single-engine aircraft, torque is manageable through design, compromises trimming the aircraft slightly, adjusting control surface angles, accepting some asymmetric behavior. Pilots learn to compensate with rudder pressure, particularly during takeoff and in slow-speed flight. It becomes second nature. In a twin-engine aircraft with both propellers rotating in the same direction, torque becomes more complex. During normal flight, the torque effects from both engines roughly cancel out in terms of roll, though they create a persistent yaw tendency. But in asymmetric situations during single-engine operation, if one engine fails, or during hard maneuvering when engine power settings differ, the torque becomes a serious handling problem. The aircraft wants to roll, to yaw, to depart from controlled flight in ways that require constant pilot attention and significant control deflection. Johnson's team made a decision that seemed obvious in retrospect, but was far from standard practice in 1937. They would make the engines rotate in opposite directions. The left engine would turn its propeller counterclockwise when viewed from the pilot's position. The right engine would turn clockwise. The torque forces would cancel completely. This decision required engineering work that most manufacturers would have avoided. It meant designing and manufacturing mirror-image engine installations. The left-hand engine needed a different gear reduction system than the right-hand engine. Maintenance procedures had to account for two different propeller rotation directions. Parts could not be interchanged between left and right engines without modification. Manufacturing costs increased because you could not simply build identical engine packages and install them on both sides. But the aerodynamic advantages were substantial. With counter-rotating propellers, the P-38 would have no net torque in symmetrical flight. The critical phase of takeoff, when most fighters were vulnerable to torque-induced accidents, would be inherently safer. Single-engine operation, always dangerous in a twin, would be more manageable because the remaining engine's torque would not try to roll the aircraft. And in hard maneuvering in combat, the aircraft would respond to control inputs without fighting against asymmetric torque forces. The Allison V1000 710 engine that powered the P-38 was a 12-cylinder liquid-cooled design, producing 1,150 horsepower in its initial version, eventually upgraded to 1,475 horsepower in later variants. Allison Engine Company, based in Indianapolis, manufactured these engines with meticulous attention to the demanding specifications required for high-altitude military service. The V1000 710 used a single-stage, single-speed supercharger in early versions, later upgraded to more sophisticated turbocharging systems that maintained power at altitude. For the P-38, Allison produced two distinct versions of the V1000 710, the F-series for the left engine and the D-series for the right engine. The primary difference lay in the gear reduction between the engine crankshaft and the propeller shaft. The F-series used a gear train that resulted in counterclockwise propeller rotation. The opposite-hand series produced clockwise rotation. Everything else, displacement, compression ratio, fuel system, cooling requirements, remained identical. This created a unique logistics challenge. A maintenance depot supporting P-38 operations needed to stock two separate engine types and ensure they were installed on the correct side of the aircraft. A crew chief could not simply pull an engine from a damaged P-38 and install it on any available aircraft without paying attention to which side it came from. The potential for installation errors was real and required careful tracking and verification. But the engineering team at Lockheed judged this complexity worthwhile because of what it enabled in flight characteristics. A fighter pilot in combat operates at the edge of aircraft performance. He pushes the machine to its limits, trading altitude for speed, speed for turning radius, straight-line flight for violent maneuvers. In these extreme conditions, any characteristic that makes the aircraft more predictable, more responsive, more forgiving of aggressive control inputs, directly translates to tactical advantage. The counter-rotating propellers gave P-38 pilots an aircraft that flew like a much smaller, lighter fighter in terms of control response, despite weighing as much as many twin-engine bombers. When Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Johnson, who would eventually become the top-scoring P-38 ace in the Pacific, with 22 confirmed victories, first flew the Lightning in training, he noted in his post-flight report that the aircraft had no bad habits. Did what you asked it to do, when you asked, without surprises. This predictability came directly from eliminating torque effects. In a hard turn, a P-38 pilot could focus entirely on his target, on his airspeed and angle of attack, on his tactical position relative to enemy aircraft. He did not have to fight the aircraft itself, did not have to apply constant rudder pressure to prevent yaw, did not have to anticipate the aircraft's tendency to tighten or loosen the turn based on which direction he was turning. Left turns and right turns felt identical. The aircraft was neutral, balanced, honest. For pilots transitioning from single-engine fighters, this took some adjustment. Fighter pilots develop unconscious habits, constant small control inputs that compensate for their aircraft's quirks. A P-51 Mustang pilot automatically applied right rudder during climbs and left-hand turns. A P-40 pilot knew his aircraft wanted to roll right during high-speed dives. These compensations became automatic, invisible, part of the pilot's muscle memory. The P-38 had no such quirks related to torque. New pilots initially over-controlled, applying rudder pressure that was not needed, making trim adjustments that were unnecessary. It took several hours of flight time to unlearn the compensations and trust that the aircraft would simply go where you pointed it. Once pilots made that adjustment, they gained an aircraft that could outturn fighters that should have had every advantage in maneuverability. The first P-38 seconds arrived in the Southwest Pacific Theater in December 1942, assigned to the 39th Fighter Squadron operating from Port Moresby, New Guinea. The squadron had been flying P-400 Aero Cobras, a variant of the P-39 that lacked the performance needed for high-altitude combat. The Aero Cobra, despite its innovative design with the engine mounted behind the pilot, struggled against Japanese fighters at altitude. Its single Allison engine, without adequate supercharging, lost power rapidly above 12,000 feet. Zero pilots had learned to simply climb above P-400 formations and attack from positions where the American fighters could barely respond. The P-38 changed this tactical equation immediately. Its twin turbocharged engines maintained full power to 25,000 feet. The aircraft could climb to that altitude in under 7 minutes faster than a Zero could manage the same climb. More importantly, it could sustain high speeds at altitude, where the Zero's lightweight construction became a disadvantage. Above 20,000 feet, the Zero's controls stiffened, its rate of roll decreased, and its superior low-speed maneuverability meant nothing because both aircraft were operating at high indicated airspeeds. But the real surprise came in medium-altitude combat between 15,000 and 20,000 feet, where most engagements occurred. This was the Zero's optimal fighting environment. Japanese pilots expected to dominate here against any American fighter, especially a twin-engine design that weighed more than twice what their A6M carried. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Porky Cragg took command of the 39th Fighter Squadron in January 1943 and immediately began developing tactics that exploited the P-38's unique characteristics. Cragg had studied every available intelligence report on Zero performance and capabilities. He knew the Japanese fighter could outturn any American aircraft in service at low speeds. The standard tactical guidance warned pilots never to try turning with a Zero instead. Use speed and altitude advantage to make high-speed passes, then climb away before the Zero could respond. Cragg discovered something different in practice flights against captured Zero aircraft that the Allies had acquired for testing. The P-38 could, in fact, turn with a Zero if the pilot understood the energy management involved. The key was maintaining airspeed above 250 miles per hour. At those speeds, the P-38's larger control surfaces and counter-rotating propellers gave it a turning capability that matched or exceeded the Zero's performance. The Zero pilot faced a fundamental problem in high-speed turns. His aircraft's lightweight construction, which gave it superb low-speed maneuverability, became a liability at higher speeds. The control forces increased dramatically. The stick required significant physical strength to deflect. The rate of roll decreased because the pilot could not move the controls quickly enough. The airframe itself flexed under G-loads in ways that affected control response. The P-38 had none of these problems. Its hydraulically boosted ailerons remained responsive at high speeds. The counter-rotating propellers meant the aircraft had no preference for left or right turns. Both directions felt identical to the pilot. The robust construction, necessary to carry the weight of two engines and heavy armament, handled high-G maneuvering without structural concerns. A P-38 pilot could sustain a hard turn at high speed far longer than a Zero pilot could, and the American aircraft would respond more crisply to control inputs throughout the maneuver. Cragg formalized these observations into tactical doctrine. P-38 pilots would engage Zeros at high speed, maintain energy throughout the fight, and use hard, sustained turns rather than attempting slow-speed horizontal scissors maneuvers where the Zero excelled. If a pilot found himself slow, the correct response was to dive away, rebuild speed, and re-engage from a position of energy advantage. The 39th Fighter Squadron began scoring consistent victories using these tactics. Japanese pilots reported encounters with American twin-engine fighters that seemed to violate everything they understood about aircraft performance. Intelligence officers in Rabaul collected these reports with growing concern. Multiple pilots described P-38 seconds matching their turns in combat, staying with them through maneuvers that should have left the heavy aircraft behind. The reports were consistent enough that they could not be dismissed as pilot error or combat confusion. On April 18, 1943, American intelligence intercepted and decoded Japanese naval communications, revealing that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet and architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville to inspect forward bases. The flight plan was specific: departure at 0600 hours, arrival at Balale Airfield at 0800 hours, flying in a Mitsubishi G-4M bomber escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The opportunity was unprecedented. President Franklin Roosevelt personally authorized the mission. Major John Mitchell, commanding the 339th Fighter Squadron, received orders to intercept and destroy Yamamoto's aircraft. The mission required flying 435 miles from Guadalcanal to the interception point, navigating at wave-top altitude to avoid Japanese radar detection, then climbing, to intercept altitude, engaging the escort, destroying the bombers, and returning to base, all on the P-38's internal fuel supply. Mitchell selected 18 P-38 seconds for the mission. 12 would fly top cover at 18,000 feet, engaging any Japanese fighters that attempted to interfere. 6 aircraft would form the killer flight, descending to intercept the bombers directly. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber flew in the killer flight. Both pilots had significant combat experience. Both understood the P-38's capabilities intimately. The formation departed Guadalcanal at 07:10 hours on April 18th, flying north-northwest at 50 feet above the ocean. Mitchell navigated using dead reckoning and careful timing, maintaining radio silence throughout the approach. At 09:33 hours, exactly on schedule, the P-38 seconds reached the interception point and began their climb toward Bougainville. At 09:43 hours, a lookout aboard one of the Japanese bombers spotted the American fighters and radioed an alert. The 6-0 escorts immediately turned toward the threat. Yamamoto's bomber and its wingman dove toward the jungle, attempting to reach the cover of the treetops where they might escape. The killer flight split. Lanphier's division engaged the Zeros. Barber's division pursued the bombers. What happened in the next 4 minutes demonstrated everything that Lockheed's engineers had designed into the P-38. Barber found himself chasing Yamamoto's bomber in a hard descending turn. The bomber's pilot, Chief Petty Officer First Class Takeo Kotani, was exceptionally skilled, throwing his aircraft into violent evasive maneuvers that should have made accurate gunnery impossible. 3-0 pilots broke away from Lanphier's engagement and dove after Barber, attempting to protect their admiral. Barber was in exactly the situation that conventional fighter doctrine said to avoid. Low altitude, low airspeed, multiple enemies, tight turning combat. But the P-38's counter-rotating propellers gave him options that would not have existed in any other aircraft. He could maintain a sustained hard turn without the aircraft developing asymmetric handling characteristics. He could roll from a hard left bank to a hard right bank without the transition becoming sloppy or unpredictable. The aircraft responded immediately to his control inputs. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Lieutenant Barber fired a long burst into the bomber's right engine and wing root at less than 100 yards range. The bomber began trailing smoke, continued its descending turn, and crashed into the jungle at 09:46 hours. Admiral Yamamoto died in the crash. Barber immediately broke hard left to evade the pursuing Zeros, then reversed into a hard right turn, using the P-38's neutral handling to spoil the Japanese pilot's firing solutions. One of the Zero pilots, attempting to follow Barber through this series of reversals, stalled his aircraft. At low altitude and low airspeed, the Zero's control forces made rapid roll reversals difficult. The pilot could not match the P-38's rate of direction change. His Zero, pushed beyond its performance envelope, departed controlled flight and spun into the jungle. The other 2 Zero pilots, recognizing they could not catch the P-38, broke off and returned toward Rabaul. Within 24 hours, Japanese naval intelligence officers at Rabaul began receiving combat reports from surviving Zero pilots who had engaged the American fighters. The reports were troubling. Multiple pilots described American twin-engine fighters positively identified as P-38 seconds by their distinctive twin-boom configuration that had outmaneuvered their Zeros in sustained turning combat at medium altitude. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, the air intelligence officer, responsible for analyzing combat reports and updating tactical recommendations, read through the accounts with mounting concern. The reports contradicted everything Japanese naval aviation understood about twin-engine fighter performance. The standard intelligence assessment, distributed to all fighter units, explicitly stated that P-38 seconds were dangerous in high-speed diving attacks and had superior altitude performance, but were vulnerable in close-range turning combat due to their size and weight. Itaya ordered additional interviews with the pilots. He wanted specific details: airspeeds during engagement, altitude, the nature of the turns the P-38 seconds executed, whether the American pilots appeared to be struggling with aircraft handling or fighting confidently. The answers were consistent. The P-38 seconds had maintained speeds between 250 and 300 miles per hour. They had executed sustained turns without visible loss of control or energy. The pilots had appeared confident, aggressive, willing to enter and sustain turning engagements rather than simply making high-speed passes and running. One pilot, Petty Officer First Class Takeo Tanimizu, provided a particularly detailed account. He had engaged a P-38 inches, a sustained turning fight at 15,000 feet over Bougainville. His initial assumption was that the American pilot had made a tactical error by accepting a turning engagement. Tanimizu had expected to outturn the heavy twin and gain a firing position within 2 or 3 complete circles. Instead, the P-38 had matched his turn. When Tanimizu attempted to tighten his radius by reducing speed, the P-38 maintained position. When he reversed direction, attempting to catch the American pilot off guard, the P-38 reversed immediately, without the characteristic wallowing or delay that Tanimizu had observed in previous encounters with twin-engine aircraft. After nearly 2 complete minutes of sustained turning an eternity in air combat, Tanimizu had broken off the engagement when his fuel state became critical. He reported to Itaya that the P-38 had shown no signs of departure, no tendency to stall or spin, no asymmetric handling that would indicate engine torque problems. The aircraft had simply turned, cleanly and predictably, matching everything his Zero could do at that airspeed. Itaya compiled these reports into a formal intelligence assessment dated April 23, 1943. The document, later captured by American forces and translated, revealed the confusion within Japanese naval aviation. The assessment acknowledged that P-38 seconds appeared to have better turning performance than previously believed, but offered no explanation for this capability. The document recommended continued caution when engaging P-38 seconds and suggested that pilots should attempt to force engagements at lower speeds, where the Zero retained clear advantages. What the Japanese intelligence officers could not know what they had no way to deduce from combat. Observations alone was that the P-38's turning capability came from an engineering decision made years earlier by Lockheed's design team. The counter-rotating propellers were invisible in combat. A Japanese pilot could not determine propeller rotation direction while maneuvering at high speed. The effect was visible in the aircraft's behavior, but the cause remained hidden. Japanese technical intelligence officers eventually obtained detailed information about the P-38 through multiple channels. Crashed aircraft were examined when recoverable. Technical manuals were captured from overrun Allied bases. Some information came from German sources, as Germany received technical data on Allied aircraft through various intelligence networks. By mid-1943, Japanese engineers understood that the P-38 used counter-rotating propellers, but understanding the technical feature and incorporating it into their own designs were entirely different challenges. Japan's aircraft industry, already stretched thin by wartime production demands, could not easily implement counter-rotating propeller systems on existing designs. The tooling, the manufacturing processes, the maintenance infrastructure, everything would need to be modified. For new designs, the complexity and cost had to be weighed against other performance priorities. Japanese engineers made a calculated decision. The benefits of counter-rotating propellers, while real, did not justify the manufacturing complexity given Japan's industrial constraints and resource limitations. They would accept the torque-related handling characteristics of conventional propeller arrangements and train pilots to compensate. It was a reasonable engineering decision given the constraints they faced, but it meant that Japanese fighters would continue to have asymmetric handling characteristics that their pilots had to manage, while American P-38 pilots enjoyed perfectly balanced control response in all flight regimes. By late 1943, P-38 squadrons throughout the Pacific had refined their tactics into a comprehensive doctrine that exploited every advantage the Lightning offered. The 5th Air Force in New Guinea and the 13th Air Force in the Solomons both published tactical bulletins that codified lessons learned from hundreds of combat engagements. These documents, distributed to newly arriving P-38 pilots, emphasized aggressive maneuvering at high speed and sustained turning combat when conditions favored it. Major Thomas Maguire, who would eventually become the second highest scoring American ace with 38 confirmed victories, flew P-38 seconds exclusively throughout his combat tour. Maguire developed a fighting technique he called the offensive split S, entering combat from altitude with high speed, making a firing pass, then immediately rolling inverted and pulling through to gain separation and altitude. The maneuver required precise control and complete trust in the aircraft's handling characteristics. A conventional twin-engine fighter, fighting torque effects throughout the maneuver, could not execute this technique safely at low altitude. Maguire's success rate, he averaged 1 victory for every 4 combat sorties, demonstrated what the P-38 could do in the hands of an aggressive pilot who understood its capabilities. He frequently engaged multiple enemy aircraft simultaneously, using the Lightning's speed and maneuverability to dictate engagement terms. Japanese pilots who encountered him reported an American twin-engine fighter that seemed to be everywhere at once, appearing from impossible angles, sustaining turns that should not have been possible, breaking off and re-engaging before defensive measures could be organized. The 475th Fighter Group, arriving in the Southwest Pacific in May 1943, became the highest-scoring P-38 unit in the theater. The group flew from bases in New Guinea, escorting bombers to Rabaul and engaging Japanese fighters throughout the Bismarck Archipelago. Between May 1943 and the end of the war, the 475th was credited with 551 confirmed aerial victories against the loss of 157 aircraft in combat, a kill ratio of approximately 3.5 to 1. For a theater where Japanese pilots had significant experience and capable aircraft, this ratio represented remarkable success. The group's tactics emphasized formation integrity and mutual support. But within those formations, individual pilots had freedom to maneuver aggressively. The P-38's handling characteristics made tight formation flying easier than in single-engine fighters because pilots did not have to constantly trim for changing power settings. The aircraft maintained stable flight attitudes with minimal control input. This stability allowed pilots to focus on situational awareness rather than basic aircraft control. Japanese fighter units facing these P-38 groups adapted their tactics over time. They learned to avoid sustained turning engagements at medium altitude. They developed hit-and-run techniques, diving from altitude to make a single pass, then diving away before the P-38 seconds could respond. They attempted to force engagements at lower altitudes where speed decreased, and the Zero's superior low-speed handling became relevant again. Some units experimented with formation tactics designed to trap individual P-38 seconds between multiple attackers, denying the American pilot the space needed for high-speed maneuvering. But these adaptations came at a cost. Japanese pilots were fighting defensively, reacting to American strengths rather than exploiting their own aircraft's capabilities. The psychological impact was significant. Fighter pilots depend on confidence in their equipment and their ability to win engagements. When that confidence erodes when pilots begin avoiding combat situations, they previously sought effectiveness decreases, regardless of technical skill or tactical knowledge. Lieutenant Junior Grade Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces with 64 confirmed victories, wrote in his post-war memoir about the frustration of engaging P-38 seconds. Sakai had exceptional flying skill and years of combat experience. He understood energy management, deflection shooting, and tactical positioning as well as any pilot in the war. But he described the P-38 as an aircraft that did not fight the way American fighters were supposed to fight. It turned when it should have run. It sustained maneuvers when it should have departed controlled flight. It appeared in positions that should have been impossible given its size and weight. Sakai's frustration reflected a broader problem within Japanese naval aviation. The Imperial Navy had built its fighter tactics around the assumption that Japanese aircraft would have superior maneuverability in all circumstances. Pilot training emphasized turning combat, close-range engagements, and sustained dogfighting. The Zero had been designed specifically to excel in these situations, accepting trade-offs in other areas: armor protection, diving speed, high-altitude performance to maximize turning capability. The P-38 challenged these assumptions by demonstrating that superior turning performance could be achieved through different means. Rather than minimizing weight and maximizing lift, Lockheed had eliminated torque effects and provided powerful control surfaces. Rather than accepting slow speeds in combat, P-38 pilots maintained high-energy states where their aircraft's characteristics dominated. The result was an aircraft that could fight the Zero's fight, but on American terms, at American speeds, with American tactical flexibility. The counter-rotating propeller configuration that gave the P-38 its unique handling characteristics represented a broader principle in aircraft design: that seemingly minor technical decisions could have profound tactical consequences. Lockheed's engineers had not set out to revolutionize fighter tactics. They had simply solved an engineering problem, managing torque in a twin-engine fighter, by choosing a solution that added manufacturing complexity but provided significant aerodynamic benefits. This design philosophy, accepting manufacturing complexity to achieve superior performance, became increasingly common in American aircraft development as the war progressed. The P-51 Mustang's laminar flow wing required precise manufacturing tolerances that added cost and production time, but provided exceptional high-speed performance and range. The F-4U, Corsair's inverted gull wing, complicated construction, but allowed a shorter landing gear while maintaining propeller clearance. The B-29 Superfortress incorporated dozens of technical innovations, each adding complexity, but together creating a bomber capable of missions no other aircraft could perform. Japan's aircraft industry, facing severe resource constraints and an industrial base that could not match American production capacity, generally moved in the opposite direction. Designs emphasized simplicity, ease of manufacture, and efficient use of limited materials. The Ki-84 Hayate fighter, introduced in 1944 as Japan's most advanced army fighter, used conventional propeller rotation and simpler systems than comparable American fighters. It was an excellent aircraft by any objective measure: fast, maneuverable, well-armed, but it lacked the refinements that American fighters incorporated as standard features. The difference in design philosophy reflected the different strategic situations each nation faced. The United States had the industrial capacity to build complex, sophisticated aircraft in large numbers. American factories could maintain production of multiple aircraft types simultaneously, each optimized for specific roles. The military could accept longer development times and higher unit costs in exchange for superior performance, because the malicized industrial base could support those decisions. Japan could not afford such luxuries. Every aircraft design had to be manufacturable with existing tools and limited materials. Production runs had to be long to justify tooling investments. Designs had to be simple enough that relatively inexperienced workers could build them as the pool of skilled craftsmen diminished. The Imperial Navy and Army frequently competed for the same limited industrial resources, creating inefficiencies and duplication that Japan's economy could not sustain. By 1944, this disparity in design philosophy and industrial capacity had created a qualitative gap that Japanese pilots faced every time they encountered American aircraft. The P-38, still in frontline service with continuously improved variants, now faced Japanese fighters that were technically more advanced than the early war Zero, but still could not overcome the fundamental advantages that Lockheed had built into the Lightning's design 30 years earlier. The P-38 liters, the final production variant, incorporated all the lessons learned from 3 years of combat operations. It had improved engines producing 1,475 horsepower each, giving it a top speed of 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. It had hydraulically boosted ailerons that remained responsive at high speeds. It had improved cockpit heating, better visibility, and upgraded armament. But the core design, the twin-boom configuration, the counter-rotating propellers, the fundamental aerodynamic characteristics remained unchanged from Kelly Johnson's original 1937 concept. This design longevity itself testified to the soundness of the original engineering decisions. Aircraft designs that have fundamental flaws reveal those flaws in combat and require extensive redesign. The P-38 required refinements and improvements, certainly, but the basic concept proved sound from the first production aircraft to the last. The counter-rotating propellers, initially seen by some engineers as an unnecessary complication, proved to be one of the design's greatest strengths. Lockheed produced 10,037 P-38 seconds between 1941 and 1945 across all variants. This was far fewer than the 15,000 P-51 Mustangs or the 12,000 F-4U Corsairs produced during the same period. But the P-38 filled roles that no other aircraft could perform as effectively. It served as a long-range escort fighter, a photo reconnaissance platform, a night fighter, and a fighter bomber. Its twin-engine reliability made it ideal for overwater operations in the Pacific, where engine failure in a single-engine fighter meant almost certain loss of pilot and aircraft. The engineering team that had designed the P-38's counter-rotating propeller system never received public recognition for their specific contribution. Hall Hibbard and Kelly Johnson received credit for the overall design, which was appropriate given their roles as leaders of the design team. But the engineers who worked out the details of the mirror-image engine installations, who designed the gear reduction systems that made opposite rotation possible, who solved the manufacturing and maintenance challenges, their names do not appear in most histories of the aircraft. Yet their work changed fighter combat in the Pacific. Every P-38 pilot who pushed his aircraft into a hard turn and found it responding predictably, every engagement won because the Lightning could sustain maneuvers that enemy pilots did not expect. Every successful mission completed because the aircraft handled exactly as needed. All of this flowed from that engineering decision to accept manufacturing complexity in exchange for aerodynamic excellence. The story of the P-38's counter-rotating propellers and the tactical advantages they provided might seem, at first consideration, to be merely a technical footnote in the broader narrative of the Pacific War. But for the men who flew these aircraft, and for the Japanese pilots who faced them, these engineering decisions had life-or-death consequences that extended far beyond abstract aerodynamic principles. Lieutenant Rex Barber, who shot down Admiral Yamamoto's bomber while flying a P-38, survived the war with 5 confirmed aerial victories. In post-war interviews, he consistently emphasized that the Lightning's handling characteristics had saved his life multiple times. In the engagement over Bougainville, when Zero fighters pursued him at low altitude after he destroyed Yamamoto's aircraft, he survived by executing a series of hard reversing turns that exploited the P-38's neutral handling. A conventional twin-engine fighter, fighting torque effects throughout those maneuvers, would likely have departed controlled flight at the low altitude and airspeeds involved. Major Thomas Maguire, who had developed such effective tactics for aggressive P-38 combat, died on January 7, 1945, over Negros Island in the Philippines. He was leading a 4-plane patrol when they encountered Japanese fighters. Maguire attempted a low-altitude, low-airspeed turn to protect his wingman. The P-38, operating at the edge of its performance envelope with external fuel tanks still attached, stalled and spun into the ground. He was 24 years old. His death illustrated that even the P-38's superior handling characteristics had limits, and that aggressive combat flying involved risks that no engineering solution could completely eliminate. For Japanese pilots who survived the war, the experience of facing aircraft like the P-38 left psychological scars that extended beyond the immediate trauma of combat. Saburo Sakai, interviewed decades after the war, described a growing sense of futility that developed among Japanese fighter pilots as the war progressed. They were flying obsolescent aircraft against opponents who had numerical superiority, better equipment, and industrial support that seemed limitless. Every engagement reinforced the disparity. Every loss was replaced quickly on the American side, slowly or not at all on the Japanese side. The technical advantages that American aircraft enjoyed, advantages like the P-38's counter-rotating propellers, became symbols of the larger industrial and technological gap between the two nations. Japanese pilots understood that they were not losing because of inferior skill or courage. They were losing because their opponents had better tools, built by an industrial base that Japan could not match. This understanding, Sakai recalled, was more demoralizing than simple fear. Fear could be overcome through training and willpower. Industrial inadequacy could not be overcome through any amount of individual courage. The broader strategic lesson of the P-38's success in the Pacific extended far beyond fighter tactics. The aircraft demonstrated that technological sophistication, supported by industrial capacity, provided advantages that tactical excellence alone could not overcome. Japanese fighter pilots were among the best trained and most experienced in the world at the start of the Pacific War. Their aircraft, particularly the Zero, were well designed for their intended role. But as the war progressed and American aircraft like the P-38 entered service in increasing numbers, Japanese advantages in training and experience became less decisive. By 1945, the disparity had become overwhelming. Japanese fighter units defending the home islands against B-29 raids faced American escort fighters that were superior in virtually every measurable characteristic. The P-38 Seconds, P-47 Thunderbolts, and P-51 Mustangs that accompanied the bombers could outclimb, outdive, outrun, and in the case of the P-38, even outturn the Japanese interceptors opposing them. Japanese pilots flew to meet these raids, knowing that survival was unlikely and that their sacrifice would, at best, shoot down a handful of bombers from formations of hundreds. The engineering decision that Lockheed's team had made in 1937 to use counter-rotating propellers, despite the manufacturing complexity, had seemed at the time to be a technical detail, important to the pilots who would fly the aircraft but unlikely to change the course of the war. Yet that decision, multiplied across thousands of combat engagements over 4 years of war, contributed to American air superiority in the Pacific. It gave American pilots an aircraft that could fight effectively in any tactical situation. It forced Japanese pilots to develop defensive tactics that limited their effectiveness. It demonstrated that careful engineering and willingness to accept manufacturing complexity could produce tactical advantages that simpler, more conventional designs could not match. The morning of August 7, 1943, when Lieutenant Rex Barber rolled his P-38 into that hard left turn over Bougainville, he was not thinking about engineering decisions or propeller rotation directions. He was thinking about the Zero in front of him, about his airspeed and altitude, about getting his guns pointed at the target. But his ability to execute that turn, to stay with the Zero through a maneuver that should have been impossible for a twin-engine fighter, came directly from decisions made by engineers he would never meet, in a design office in Burbank, California, years before the war began. That is the deeper truth that the P-38 story reveals. Wars are fought by individuals, pilots, soldiers, sailors who face immediate tactical situations that demand courage, skill, and split-second decisions. But those individual battles are won or lost based on decisions made far from the battlefield, by engineers and designers and factory workers who create the tools that combatants use. The P-38's counter-rotating propellers did not win the Pacific War, but they gave American fighter pilots an advantage in thousands of individual engagements, and the accumulation of those small advantages, repeated across years of combat, contributed to the outcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.